Greetings all, and welcome to Lucas Brews. In this full build video, I'll be putting together the 1/72nd scale Focke-Wulf 190 D-9 from Academy, which was originally released in 1998. So join me as I upgrade this older kit with a 3D printed cockpit and some wheels, assemble the model and see how it goes together, paint it up in a eye-catching scheme from JV44, and apply a bit of oil, enamel, and acrylic paint weathering. So without further ado, let's get into making this Dora. To start with, I gave all of the plastic and 3D printed parts which I'd already cleaned in alcohol and cured a wash in some warm soapy water, and once everything was dry, I then removed the resin cockpit seat, instrument panel, floor section, wheels, headrest, and control columns from their supports. The fuselage halves were cut out of their sprue along with the kit's headrest, engine cowling, and propeller assembly. I decided to assemble the prop, which uses a typical washer system to lock the propeller to the engine, and then a spinner that goes on the front. There were a few burrs from the attachment points that needed cleaning up before I started to remove the excess plastic from the fuselage parts so that my resin cockpit would fit. Removing the rear section was pretty easy, and the fit of the cockpit floor was perfect, although the glare shield would not quite fit so well. To fill in some of the print lines on the cockpit's rear section, I applied some Vallejo water-based putty, and then removed the excess so that it would remain in only the print line's gaps. After letting the putty dry overnight, I then attached the cockpit parts to a cocktail stick with some blue tack, and started to prime them along with the fuselage halves using some Vallejo acrylic gloss black primer. Originally, I was going to build my resin cockpit and the out-of-the-box plastic one side by side to see how they compare, but in the end I only ended up doing the resin one. After letting the primer cure for a few hours, I then mixed up 6 drops of acrylic flow improver with 6 drops of Vallejo Model Air RLM66 for the cockpit's internal colour. This is a very dark colour, so to add some highlights and depth to the details, I then added a drop of Insignia White to the mix and did a few light passes over the top. I then started to pick out the details in the cockpit using Vallejo Model Colour Deep Sky Blue for the oxygen indicators and switches, Model Colour Flat Yellow for several gauges and part of the sidewall details, and also Model Colour Saddle Brown, which was used for the glare shield trim, a base colour for some of the gauges, a few switches, and a base colour for the leather seat cushion. Model Colour Vermilion Red was then used for some switches and gauges, and once all of these colours were dry, I then painted the recessed faces on the gauges with Model Colour Flat Black. I find this step easiest when the black has been thinned down with some water so that it will flow into the gauge face using capillary motion, a bit like a thick wash. Though not very visible at this scale, I attempted to dry brush the landing gear indicator lights with Vermilion Red and Deep Green before brushing a thin coat of Model Colour Light Brown onto the seat. To make all of the details really pop, I then dipped a brush in some Model Air Insignia White, wiped off most of the paint, and then dry brushed over the entire cockpit. For some gauges, I dry brushed with more paint to pick up the raised gauge details designed into them. Once the details had been dry brushed on the control column, I then got out some Model Colour Buff and painted the raised seat belts. I've also designed a set of seats without the belts so that you can fit your own decal or photo etch ones instead, or perhaps a pilot, but I quite like the effect that the resin ones have. Model Air aluminium was applied onto the rudder pedals, the gun sight and metal buckles on the seats, and then similar to the Insignia White, I removed the excess paint from my brush and dry brushed the aluminium in certain spots to add some metal chipping, mainly to the cockpit floor, the control column and the seat. The edges of the seat belts of 190 seem to have a darker section, which I carefully painted with Model Colour Chocolate Brown, and then as a final method of making the details pop and to add a bit of subtle grime and dirt, I applied a layer of Tamiya Black Enamel wash on all of the cockpit parts. Once applied, the excess wash would then be removed using some X20 enamel thinners and a cotton bud, and then for the final touch, I dabbed some Vallejo acrylic gloss varnish onto the gauges to give them a slight reflectiveness to represent the glass on them. With everything painted and weathered, I then assembled the cockpit by installing the joystick and seat with some super glue, and reattaching the canopy's opening handle, which I'd accidentally knocked off earlier. I think the details inside of the cockpit turned out pretty good, and I also thoroughly enjoyed designing and painting my own cockpits in this way. The STL files for this one and several others are available for purchase on my Cult page, a link to which I'll leave in the description. I then glued the cockpit floor to the left fuselage half, followed by the instrument panel. As mentioned, the fit of the cockpit floor was really good, though I should have thinned down the sidewalls a tiny bit, especially around the glare shield area, so that I could have had it a little bit more raised and flush with the front canopy area. Once the cockpit had been adjusted and was firmly in place, I then applied some Revell Contactor Professional along the edges of the fuselage, and some more superglue on the exposed edges of the resin cockpit assembly, and then joined the right side of the fuselage. It only took a bit of pressure to hold the fuselage halves together, and there was only a small gap in the rear of the cockpit, but this would be easy to clean up later on. To prevent any further gaps and give a strong bond between the fuselage halves, I would then wrap them tightly in masking tape and use bulldog clips to hold them together as the glue bonded, and I also then ran some Tamiya extra thin along the seam lines to melt them together. While these parts bonded, I cut out the lower wing and 2 upper wing pieces, along with the horizontal stabilizers, a section of sprue which had the landing gear doors, the upper surface of the cowling with the machine guns, and the supercharger ram intake. These parts were filed and then sanded of any flash, and once the masking tape was removed from the fuselage, I glued the upper cowling part and engine into place. Despite a lack of any guidance parts, the upper cowling fitted very well into place without any overhang or gap along the fuselage sides. The fuselage has a D-shaped key to make sure the engine is installed in the correct orientation. The stabilizers were attached next, and they fitted okay, but needed a bit of pressure to stop them from having a die or anhedral. I glued the lower wing piece to the fuselage first without drilling any holes out for the drop tanks, since I couldn't find any photos of JV-44-190s with the racks fitted, although granted most of the photos I looked at were after they had been captured. The lower wings fitted decently, so I then attached the upper wing parts to the wings and fuselage and clamped these into place. I found that attaching the upper portions of the wings after the lower one had been attached to the fuselage made it easier to adjust the angle of the wings dihedral, so there wouldn't be a large gap between the upper surface of the wings and the fuselage at the roots. The supercharger intake halves were glued together before being attached immediately to the fuselage, and they went together pretty well, but there was a slight gap between the halves. Tamiya Extra Thin was once again applied over the seam lines, and then to fill the larger gaps, I used a bit of Vallejo water-based putty. This was mainly for the rear cockpit section, though I should have applied some on the intake gap as well, but unfortunately I didn't notice it until later on. After leaving the model aside for 24 hours to let the putty cure, I did some final bits of sanding to remove any excess putty or remaining flash and seam lines, and once done I masked the cockpit off with some blue tack, and then sprayed the lower and upper surface of the model along with the landing gear doors with the Vallejo Gloss Black Primer to prepare the model for painting. I did my best to gradually build up the primer in multiple passes so that the surface was just starting to become wet, but not so built up that the primer pooled. Once everything was a uniform solid gloss black, I then set the model aside to allow the primer a good 24 hours to fully cure before painting. For painting, I decided to first do the iconic underside red and white markings that JV-44 would become famous for. To make masking as easy as possible, and since I like to start with the lightest colour first, I began by painting the underside with insignia white, then to an even ratio of 1 part Vallejo acrylic flow improver to 1 part paint. This was sprayed at around about 25 psi, although my airbrush was slightly clogged when I did this, so that was a bit higher than I would normally use. I applied the paint in the centre of each panel initially, and then do a final layer that's more uniform to create some pre-shading. The insignia white was also applied on the upper surface to create some highlights and pre-shading for the upper surface camouflage as well. I really love working with the Vallejo Model Air paints, as they're not as harmful as lacquers or enamels to spray, they're very easy to clean up, and provided you maintain your airbrush and thin the paints correctly to your conditions, they're also pretty reliable. Although the acrylics dried to the touch within minutes, I like to let them cure for at least an hour or so before doing any masking on them, so once the insignia white had been applied, I mixed up some model colour flat pink and more of the insignia white to paint the spinner. This first coat would then be followed by a layer of Model Air RLM04 yellow, which is much easier to do over a pink surface. Although the kit includes decals for the white stripes, my plan for this model was to instead now use 1mm masking tape to mask off the white which I'd just applied, using the decals as a rough guide to line them up. I suspect being very late in the war and done in the field meant these markings were not always applied perfectly, but I still tried to keep them straight and eyeballed the same distance between the masking tape and the gaps in the decals. Once the mask strips were applied, I could then spray the red underside. For this, I wanted a pale brownish red to try and match some of the reference photos I had, so after doing some tests, I settled on mixing a mix of model colour vermilion red and pale brown. Since these paints are from the Vallejo model colour acrylic range, they're not as thin as their dedicated airbrushing range, so I added a drop of Vallejo retardiner and then mixed 3 drops of Vallejo acrylic thinners, 6 drops of acrylic flow improver, 3 drops of the vermilion red, and 2 drops of the pale brown, so a much thinner paint ratio than I would normally use. This was then gradually applied on the underside, first along the panel lines, and then I filled the areas in, once again creating a subtle pre-shading effect like I'd done with the white, but in reverse. Eventually, I had a coverage I was pretty happy with, so I let the paint cure for a few hours before I then masked off the entire underside of the wings and fuselage. After looking at reference photos, I decided to keep the masking on the edge of the wings and rear fuselage area quite sharp, but around the nose, to have the red a bit more messy, I tore the bits of masking tape to make it a bit rougher, and I also peeled it back slightly for some overspray. 8 drops of Vallejo acrylic flow improver were then mixed with 5 drops of AK Interactive acrylic thinners and 6 drops of AK Interactive RLM 76 Variation 1. This was then sprayed onto the fuselage sides and tail, and also used to strengthen the pre-shading on the wings. For German colours, I like to use AK Interactive's 3rd gen acrylic range, since they use the RLM codes, and to my eye their colours seem quite accurate. I have been brush painting with them for a number of years now, although they're a lot harder to airbrush with as they seem to spray less consistently. So I may at some point try some of the camo colours with Vallejo Model Airs range as well, since they also have RLM codes. For this model, I decided to take a different approach to my previous 190s, where I'd only masked the underside off and done the camouflage pattern by airbrush without any masks. This time, I decided to use some AK Interactive masking putty to mask off the RLM 76 fuselage sides and prevent any overspray. Since the putty is pretty malleable, it can also be easily applied and adjusted to create more organic curves and shapes than masking tape can achieve, although I'd recommend applying paint immediately after it's been put on the model, as the putty does have a tendency to creep down vertical surfaces and build up in areas due to gravity. The instructions called for RLM 83 and 82, though from my research and according to AK Interactive's paint range, RLM 83 appears to be a rarely used dark blue that was supposed to be used on Mediterranean theatre aircraft late in the war, and it's often mislabeled on other late war paint schemes. Instead, after looking at reference photos of a JV44-190 which may have been colorized, I decided to instead use AK Interactive's RLM 82 and 81 variation number 2. Since RLM 82 would be the lightest of these two colors, I started applying it at the same ratio of thinness to paint that I'd done with RLM 76. For some highlights and paint variation, I then added a couple of drops of Vallejo Model Air Sky Type S to the RLM 82 to saturate it, and applied this mixture in the centre of random panels and surfaces more exposed to sunlight. I kept this effect pretty subtle though, as I didn't want an overly weathered looking 190, but I do find it's best with pre-shading to do it slightly heavier than you want it to be in the end, as it will be toned down massively by subsequent layers of varnish and the weathering. Like I'd done with the RLM 76, I then used AK Interactive putty to mask off the RLM 82, before then applying the 81. Around the engine cowling, the marking guide showed a sharp and straight difference along the access hatches, so I masked this off with masking tape for a stronger edge, which I'd also done along the wing root. But for all the other shapes, I would carefully form them with the putty. The RLM 81 variation 2 was applied with the same mixture and in the same way as I'd done with RLM 82 previously. Once again, Sky Type S would also be used to create some highlights and fading, and once that had been done, I carefully removed the putty masking, and I have to say I was really happy with the results. There were a few small mistakes which I neatened up by brush, especially around the forward engine cowling, and although the edges were a little bit sharp for my liking, the contrast between the RLM 82 and 81 looked pretty good to me, and I would be fixing the things up with the next stage, creating some mottling. Keeping just the red and white areas masked off, I went ahead and mixed up some more RLM 82 with 2 drops of AK Interactive thinners to 2 drops of paint for a thicker mixture. I then very carefully applied the paint along the borders of the fuselage and RLM 82 in a gentle up and down motion to soften the fuselage camouflage demarcation with some overspray. For the modelling, I would then gradually add the shapes from the marking guide and reference photos I had, finding that keeping the airflow on with a very small amount of paint being let through constantly and creating the shapes by changing the distance of the airbrush from the fuselage sides worked pretty well. On this aircraft, the rudder appeared to have a slightly different pattern with the modelling, so while painting the tail I masked the rudder off, and then I switched the masking tape to the tail to mask the patterns from each other. This process would then be repeated with the RLM81 Variation 2 at the same ratio, and once done I'd achieved a more gradual transition between the greens and lighter blue fuselage sides, and perhaps the best modelling I've done so far in my opinion, although I probably should have been more careful masking off the rudder as it was a bit of a rush job, and I did actually remove some of the mottling, creating some scratches. The real fun would then come when removing the masking tape from the underside and revealing all of the tiny white stripes which came up perfectly. For someone still getting used to masking, this was pretty awesome to do. Unfortunately though, I did find that some of the masking tape had been in the way when I mottled the rear fuselage, but fortunately it was easy enough to reposition the masking tape and blend these areas again with some more mottling. To finish off painting some finer details, I switched back to the old reliable hairy stick, painting the propeller with several coats of AK Interactive RLM70, thinned down with a bit of water. After looking at a coloured reference photo, I decided to paint the main struts and inside landing gear doors with RLM76 Variation 1, which is the same colour I used on the fuselage sides and would have normally been applied on the underside of the wings. Normally, I would paint the inside of the wheel wells with Model Air RLM02 Grey, though I still use this colour for the wheel wells. I'm no expert, so perhaps this isn't an accurately colorized photo, but I can imagine some 190s having their entire landing gear struts both inside and out painted in the same colour as the external side, much like some US Navy aircraft had at the time. Either way, it was something a little bit different on this 190, and to my knowledge appears to be based on an accurate source. After I'd brushed on a few coats of these colours, they were nice and solid, though I had to redo the yellow on the spinner tip as I'd accidentally overpainted it with the darker RLM70. To do this, I ended up mixing some more of the Model Air Insignia White and Model Colour Pink, mounted the aircraft up and held a brush to the spinner and spun the propeller to get a clean continuous edge without using any masking. This process was then repeated with RLM04 Yellow, and I was happy with the result. The landing gear struts were cut out of their sprues and installed to the underside of the wings. Initially I did this backwards though, but quickly corrected this. Then to add a bit of strength and detail, I added some hydraulic lines using some thin metal wire before adding the landing gear's outer doors and doing some final touch-ups and painting the wiring with some RLM76. To seal in the paint and prepare the model for decals, I then sprayed it in several coats of Vallejo gloss varnish. In theory, this would prevent the decals from silvering by creating a smooth surface, making it harder for air to become trapped under them, though in some spots they would still slightly silver, perhaps due to this kit being a little bit older since I bought it second hand. The varnish would be given 24 hours to fully cure before I'd move on to applying the decals. For this, I heated up some water in a bowl and then cut the decal sheet down into manageable sections. I applied the larger roundels and markings first, dipping the sheets into the hot water for a few seconds, and once the decals started to come loose of the transfer paper, I would slide them into position and adjust them using a combination of a brush, my fingers, or very gently with the edges of my tweezers for fine adjustments. Interestingly, both blue and red numbers are included for aircraft number 1, though given the other JV-44 aircraft had red numbers, I went with red 1 as well. The common stencils were applied in the same manner, and all of them, including the walkways, were pretty sturdy and easy to apply, although the marking guide doesn't show a lot of the common markings very well, and some notable fuel placards were absent, so I used the Eduard 190A stencil guide since a lot of the common decals are, well, common with both 190 variants, and I also added some spare decals to replace the missing ones. To help the decal soften and stick to the surface of the model, I then applied some Vallejo decal softener, followed by some Tamiya decal adhesive over all of them, and gave them 24 hours to set to the model. While the decals set, I painted the trim tabs on the ailerons and rudders with vermilion red, and noticed that the horizontal stabilizers had no trim tabs in this kit, so I cut some styrene ones out, glued them into place, and painted them vermilion red as well. Both the main wheel and tail wheel were now painted a few coats of Vallejo model colour flat black, and the tail wheel struts and details were then picked out with some Vallejo Model Air RLM02 Grey. The decals did not perform so well with a fair bit of silvering, and they also didn't soften much into the recessed details, so I ended up trying to fix this by gently running a cocktail stick along some of the panel lines to push the decals down into them. I then went ahead and sealed all of the decals and the wheels with some Vallejo acrylic matte varnish to protect the decals and paint, and also give the aircraft a less shiny and more accurate finish for its scheme. Once the varnish had had 24 hours to fully cure, I then removed the blue tack masks from around the cockpit area since I was now finished spraying. The glare shield had fallen out of position but was quickly glued back into place with some of the odorless CA glue. I did some touch-ups on the rear cockpit area with some Vallejo Model Air RLM66, and then started painting the details I wanted shiny, such as parts of the landing gear strut and pitot tube with Model Air RLM01 Silver, the exhausts with Model Air Steel, and the cannon and machine gun barrels with some Model Air Gunmetal Metallic. The kit is a little bit simplified, and one part I decided to replace was the large antenna on the underside of the wing, which I instead created by slightly bending a spare Eduard 190 pitot tube to give it the distinctive tip. Before adding the more fragile details on, I went ahead and created some metal chipping using a fine brush to dry brush Vallejo Model Air aluminium onto the areas where chipping was visible in reference photos. The JV44-190s all seem to have been in reasonably good shape looking at photos, so chipping was limited to the wing route where foot traffic would regularly walk, around the engine access hatches, the leading edges of the wings, and the leading edge of the prop blades. I made a slight error using aluminium for the propeller blades, as they would have actually been made out of wood, although I believe some 190s had metal edges on their prop blades which would potentially chip. After this layer of aluminium chipping had dried, I followed up with the same technique, but using either RLM82 or RLM81 Variation 2, mixed with some insignia white for softening the edges of the metal chipping, and also creating some more superficial looking scratches. At this stage, all of the fine parts, such as the cannon barrels and pitot tubes, were now attached to the model, and I snipped away the kit's main wheel attachments to superglue on some new resin wheels which I'd designed into place. After some small touch-ups, I painted the underwing antenna a base coat of model colour flat earth, and then gave it a coat of Vallejo textured natural and dark wood grain to give it a wooden effect. I believe most 190s had their antennas painted, but since this was a late war aircraft, I decided to instead leave it in a varnished wood finish, which I know a lot of late BF-109s also had. To replicate the varnish and add a slight shine to the wheel hubs, I brushed on a thin layer of Vallejo gloss varnish and gave it 12 hours to fully cure. Next, I got ready some Uptilong 502 oil paints, including black, engine grime, buff, raw sienna and burnt amber, by squeezing them onto a piece of cardboard and leaving them aside for around about 2 hours to allow the excess oil to leak out of the paints, helping them become more matte when they would be applied to the model for weathering. During those 2 hours, I gave the whole model a coat of Tamiya black panel accent, starting with the fuselage and then doing the wings in stages. I first applied this enamel wash along all of the panel lines to darken them, highlighting the details and creating a grime buildup in all of the recesses. Once it had been applied, I would then remove the excess panel wash and help it flow more into just the gaps by then applying a layer of AK Interactive odorless thinners with a brush and using a cotton bud to wipe the excess away. Originally, I would use X20 enamel thinners to remove the excess panel wash, but on a few models, I found it was aggressive enough to start stripping the varnish layer away, which is obviously not ideal. The odorless thinners are definitely a lot less aggressive, but not quite as effective at removing the enamel wash. I noticed in a few small spots where I'd handled the model, the varnish had actually slightly come away still, but it was not really noticeable or serious, although I think I should consider some stronger varnish for final coats in future builds. Once the fuselage was done, I repeated the process on the wings and left more of the wash on the landing gear for some additional grime, and in the end I was pretty happy with the results. Next, I weathered the exhausts by applying some AK Interactive Dark Rust enamel wash onto the exhausts in a thin layer, followed by a coat of light rust wash to add a burnt oxide effect on them. By now the oil paints were ready to be used, so they were reactivated with a bit of odorless thinners, and then I started creating some exhaust stains and streaks. To do this, I used engine grime and black by dabbing them onto the exhausts, and also streaking them backwards in a slight arc along the fuselage away from the exhausts, thinning out just below the front windshield based on reference images. The edges were then softened and feathered with a brush dipped in odourless thinners to remove and manipulate the oil paints. Black was also used for some gun smoke on the cannon barrels, and dragged backwards from the shell ejection ports in the wings for some gun smoke and soot. Some subtle oil leaks and stains from the landing gear were created with engine grime and brown umber wash, and I added a build-up of dirt and dried mud on the landing gear doors and base of the rudder using a mixture of the raw sienna, burnt umber, and the buff. I added the darkest colour first, then built up the effect with the increasingly lighter browns, and after removing the excess with the thinners, repeated this process a few times until I was happy with the effect. A small amount of buff was dry brushed onto the wheels and blended in for some lighter dirt on them, and as a final touch, I dabbed on the various brown oil paints onto the wing roots, where maintenance crews might walk and traipse a bit of dirt onto the aircraft. Once the oil paint on the wings had been softened and blended with the odourless thinners, I would then sit the aircraft aside for 24 hours to allow the slow-drying oil paints to dry at least to the touch. In the meantime, I addressed the aircraft's canopy, which, unfortunately due to rather poor placement on the sprues, the main canopy sections had large imperfections on the inside. Originally, I'd vacuformed replacements, but instead I'd end up using a spare Eduard bulged canopy, since I had one and I'd accidentally gotten some milliput on the moulds I'd created with the Academy kit's original canopies. I painted the Eduard main section and a trimmed out vacuformed front windshield with a few layers of RLM66 for their internal colour first, and then for the main external colour some AK RLM82 was used to match the rest of the aircraft. The pilot's headrest had a small warning decal which I applied at this stage, and while it dried I painted the camouflage pattern on the rear canopy by applying a line while it was on the fuselage to line up the pattern with it, and then I hand painted behind the line with RLM81 variation 2. A final layer of RLM82 was then applied, and once it had dried I used a cocktail stick to gently scratch away any excess paint and neaten up the edges of the canopy frames. The front canopy would then be glued to the model with odourless CA glue since it doesn't fog up clear parts, although I found it didn't quite fit with the larger Eduard canopy, so I later removed it to make some modifications. Odourless CA glue was also used to glue the headrest to the rear canopy, although it too required repositioning, and I also had to remove the pin at the bottom so that it would fit with my narrower resin guide rails. The front windshield was trimmed slightly to improve the fit, and once that was done it was glued back on, and I then created rigging with some AK Interactive mega thin rigging wire. I first glued a bit of rigging wire to the main canopy with a small bit of odourless CA glue, and after letting it dry for a few minutes, I then applied the same glue onto the tail antenna, stretched out the rigging wire from the canopy, and then trimmed it so it was sufficiently long enough to reach the tail antenna from the canopy without much tension. The end of the rigging wire was then wrapped around the tail antenna, and pretty soon the main line was done. Once it had dried, the pin on the headrest was removed, and then I added the smaller wire leading from the rear fuselage to the main rigging line. The aircraft was pretty much done, although in several photos of JV-44-190s they seem to have a heavy amount of chipping on the rear canopies, so I created some by again dry brushing aluminium to create some bare metal, and then to soften and blend the effect in, I dry brushed in a thin layer of camouflaged colours over the aluminium. And once that was dry, I decided to call my Academy FW190D build finally completed. And here you can see the final results I achieved with this kit. I realised after filming that one of my elevator tabs has actually come off, so I'll have to replace that at some point. Apart from the slightly inaccurate chipping on the propeller blades, the paint scratching on the rudder mottling, a seam line on the supercharger intake, the older decal silvering despite the gloss varnish, and the 3D printed main panel requiring more sanding of the sidewalls to get a better fit, I think this one has still turned out really well. To prevent the issues with the main panel happening again in the future, I've now got access to a Dremel, so I'll be able to easily thin down plastic fuselage sides to better fit my 3D printed cockpits in future builds. It's definitely a simple kit with only basic recessed details present, but it goes together pretty easily, and I think it looks pretty accurate to the real 190D's form. Certainly more so than the terrible Mr. Craft 190D, which is actually the last Dora did. And I think you can tell by the photos that it's obvious there have been some improvements in both my kit choices and techniques with this one. I'm especially happy with the mottling and the vibrant red and white stripes, the choice of colours for the rest of the model, and also the weathering with the subtle chipping and oil paints. The masking putty worked really well and helped me achieve a much better contrast with the camouflage pattern, as you can see by comparing it to my older Tamiya 190A3 I did with no masking. I will definitely be using this technique on future Luftwaffe builds, and in fact I've already used it on a Eduard 190A8 which I'm currently working on. After having built it, I reckon the Academy Dora is a decent enough kit, and although I suspect the Tamiya 190 and certainly the IBG kit outclass it in terms of detail, it's a lot easier and simpler to build. Lucky for me, this one was also a lot cheaper since I bought it secondhand from a friend for just under 20 AUD, and I really enjoyed painting it, and I think it turned out pretty well with the extra cockpit details and the new 3D printed wheels. Along with the Tamiya Dora, the Academy kit doesn't seem to be available brand new, at least in Australia, so it would be nice to see Academy reissue this kit to fill the gap for a low-priced Dora between the old and dodgy Italeri reissues, the oversimplified Hobby Boss kits, and the very expensive IBG kit. Despite its shortcomings, I had fun, learnt some new techniques, and I could easily be tempted to do this one again and see how much further I can push this kit in a future build. Thank you very much for watching this build video. I do hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future build videos, inbox reviews, or stop motions. A massive thank you to my wonderful patrons for helping me to fund not only buying this kit, but also the products I used to make it, and the time I spent making the videos for it. Next week I'm planning to have at least one inbox review ready, and I'll also have a full build video coming out on the Airfix McDonnell Banshee as part of Forgotten Friday, so be sure to keep an eye out for those ones. That's it for now, but until the next time, as always, take care, and model on.